G'day guys, it's Ben again, here to bring you another video. This one is going to be looking at worm farms. Alrighty guys, so worm farms. We've got the two different versions of the worm farm, worm cafe. So the worm cafe is a great product and it's a multi-tiered worm farm. So if we take a look at the older one, you'll find a lot of these second-hand. There's still a few knocking around new in the shops, but I found there's a few problems with them that have been corrected in the new one. So basically, you've got the legs here. One of the problems that have been experienced by a lot of people is these small clips that hold the legs in place do get lost and they're hard to replace. So that's one sort of fairly minor issue. You'll notice if you look at this one, the legs tend to sort of buckle under the weight, which is a bit of an issue. Also, where the position of the tap is, it means that the rear end of this has to be lifted up slightly, and the reason for that is that occasionally you're going to get worms that fall through to the bottom layer or the collecting tray. So collecting tray, and then these three are working trays, and obviously you've got your lid on top. Alright, so on the collecting tray, sometimes you get worms that will fall through, and if there's still liquid there, then obviously the worms can drown. So that's not a good thing, and to alleviate that on the older styles, you'll need to elevate the rear of it. Otherwise, not too much of an issue. So price point for these second hand tends to be around the sort of $40 to $50 mark. I personally find that's a bit excessive, given that you can buy a brand new one that doesn't have these problems, and the new ones tend to retail for sort of the $75 or so mark. In my opinion, may as well go for a new one. That said, they don't tend to age too much. They're very robust and hard working, so there we go. Rightio, so the assembly of the new ones are really simple. The forelegs just simply sit in the collecting tray. The collecting tray doesn't need to be elevated at the rear because it's moulded in such a way that it allows the liquid to freely drain, and the tap is actually at the bottom, and then there is a small sort of island which is moulded into the plastic, and that allows the worms to essentially climb out should they fall through to that bottom layer. You then got these three working trays and the lid, and pretty much I think that's essentially the end of the features. I do find though with the new lids, they've got these little hooks in them, which means that they're going to stay up if you need to do anything to the worm farm, so that's great. When you go through to set them up, there's lots and lots of different types of worms in Australia. There's like 300 or something different ones. Most people use something like the red wrigglers and the African night crawlers, or at least those are the two that I use. In my older one, I've now got a population built up to around sort of the 5,000 or so worms. I don't actually count every single one, but that's based on as you go through and you cycle through your trays, you can get a pretty good idea of how many worms you've got and how well they're doing. Righto, so when you do get your new worm farm, and it doesn't necessarily matter which one you get, they're all set up in more or less the same way. I like to start off, you'll often get like a bedding block with these when you get them new, which is good, and that tends to break down and gives the worms a sort of a good environment just to start off with. I'm a big believer in putting down a reasonable layer of newspaper on the bottom tray. So if the trays aren't being used, you don't need to leave them there. You can if you want to, but the worms start off in this lower tray here. Then you add in some newspaper. I suggest adding in some organic compost bought from somewhere like Bunnings or a major hardware store. So something along the lines of mushroom compost, because the worms absolutely love that. You can also use other types of organic compost, and it just gives them a really good sort of starting base. I do like to use the compost that I get out of my own composting bin. I find that worms really thrive on that. So I'm not sure what I'm doing that's so right about it, but it's well aerated, and the worms really do seem to excel with that stuff. I usually start off a worm farm with roughly 1,000 or so worms, and then that will give me thereabouts of 10 litres or so of worm juice at the end of the week. So you need to keep your worm farms relatively moist but not over wet. And if you find you're starting to get things like fly larvae in there, that indicates to me that you've got the wrong pH going for your worms. So and you've got too much food. So the worms only need roughly a good handful or so of compost per day, plus the newspaper, and then on top of that you need to just to keep it moist. So if it's too dry, you're going to attract ants. If it's there's too much food, you're going to attract flies and things. These are very well designed. They're high enough off the ground that I don't need to worry about things like rats or mice, which is good. And other than that, it's just the flies and the ants. But providing you maintain your worm farm, and it's no more than 5 or 10 minutes worth of work a day, you'll get your worm juice and your worm castings. So worm juice is basically the liquid waste that the worms produce, plus the excess water that you've put through. And that can be used either directly or indirectly on your garden. It's not a liquid fertilizer, it's more like a humus or a probiotic for your garden. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. It's full of bacteria and so on, so and funguses and things like that, which are really beneficial for the garden. And if you mix the worm juice with things like worm castings and organic compost, you'll find that you produce this ultra awesome sort of compost, and that really is an amazing fertilizer to use. So liquid stuff, and the worm casting. So basically, as you add material in, you're then going to find that you need to go on to the next tray. So I've only got worms in the bottom tray, but in a week or two I'm going to be then moving on to my next tray. So that means that the worms will work their way up into the material, and there won't be too many worms left. There will be some, but not too many left in that bottom tray. Once I've reached the top of my third tray, which will usually takes a couple of months, the bottom stuff is almost exclusively just that solid waste that the worms have left behind. It's high in nutrient, it's extremely high in bacteria, and is really good in funguses and so on. So, and that can then either be used directly on the garden, or, as I say, in part of that liquid sort of fertilizer stuff. Usually takes about 2 days or so to brew it. Message me directly or leave a comment below, and I'll explain that a bit more. But basically, it's an amazing product to make. And you'll find that you can sell that, and then that just pays for the worms in the worm farm very, very quickly. It's a good way for kids to make a bit of extra pocket money if that's what they want to do. And it's a really great way to involve the kids in the garden. Very, very simple. So, as I say, you want to be adding in roughly a handful or so of compost into a tray every couple of days. Keep it moist. This is Australia, so we get pretty hot here, and you need to site your worm farms in a place where they're not getting too much direct sunlight. Otherwise, the worms will die because it gets too hot. So it needs to be in the shade, preferably, and just sort of away from too much direct sunlight. But I think we've covered most things. If you do have a question, please leave a comment below. And I'll get through and answer you guys individually as we go through. So thanks a lot, happy gardening, and I hope everything's going well for you. Well, thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please press the like button.
If you have any comments, suggestions, or questions, please feel free to share this video with Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn.
Please leave a comment below. We're looking forward to seeing you in our next video. Until then, keep safe.